Welcome to the third of 11 Landscape Summit sessions. I'm Michael Dukes, Director of Center for Land Use Efficiency here at UF IFAS. And as we've been doing these, you can put your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll take those after each talk. So first off today, we have a duo of speakers on the topic. We've got Dr. Basil Iannone, as assistant professor in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation. He's a member of the Sustainable Human and Ecological Development Group, which is within the Program for Resource Efficient Communities within the Center for Land Use Efficiency. You have a long title, Basil.
Lots of titles, yes.
His expertise is in ecology of residential landscapes. I think it's fair to say that is maybe why you came here to Florida. And your background is, his background, I don't need to tell you your background, you probably know your background, is in spatial ecology, biological invasions, and ecological restoration. He has a PhD in ecology and evolution, in the ecology and evolution program within biological sciences, University of Illinois at Chicago. Accompanying him is Wendy Wilbur. Wendy is our statewide Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator, and she's been in that position since 2015. Hard to believe. She provides leadership to county Master Gardener agents and to the more than 4,000 Master Gardener volunteers around the state. She's originally from Florida, from Miami-Dade County, and has a master's in horticulture from UF. Our second talk is going to be Dr. Mark Hostetler. He's a professor in wildlife ecology and conservation at UF. And he implements educational programs about wildlife issues and natural resource conservation of public interest. He conducts research on biodiversity and sustainable development, and he has a PhD from UF, Department of Zoology. With that, Basil and Wendy, take it away.
Great, thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. Oh, hold on, I have to share the screen here, sorry. Some delay, I apologize. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so thanks, Michael. Wendy Wilbur and I will be presenting on this talk about alternative ground cover species to increase biodiversity in Florida landscapes. And I think the entry point of this talk is this image here, where there's a lot of variation in how people manage their lawns in Florida, right? Some people really just have monoculture lawns that they put a lot of energy into to maintain that way. Other people just let whatever grow, and they mow it. And there's a variation in that. And I think the group collectively as a whole has become very interested in what are the environmental and ecological effects of that. And I think one of the reasons, well, the main reason that's an important question is, this is a current map of the distribution of lawns in the United States. There are, it's about 2% of the US land cover is actually lawns, and it actually takes up more space than any other irrigated crop, which is just still a shocking statistic to me after I lived in Illinois and Indiana and see corn. But so it's a major ecosystem in the United States and throughout the world, throughout urbanizing landscapes. So we should probably start to understand it and how to manage it effectively. And the reason for that is because improper management and poor species choices can lead to some environmental impacts, such as over irrigation and excessive water use, negative impacts on water quality if we're using too much fertilizer, and lots of runoffs occurring. And also it might lead to overuse of pesticides, which end up having negative impacts on non-target organisms and higher up the food web even. And by putting turf grass into a development where we're developing, we're also decreasing biodiversity. We're replacing plants that used to be there with, in Florida especially, we usually use a sod layout of sod of a monoculture of a clonal species. So we're losing plant species diversity and actually genetic diversity because of that clonal aspect of the sod that we're using. So these are some of the things that are some of the negatives of turf. Wendy?
Yeah, and you know, Basil and I had started talking back in 2018 and with a number of our colleagues about, is there potentially a better way? You know, we know that Florida housing is continuing to grow. I have the photo of the Villages here, and I think most of you have gone down the turnpike to see that the Villages is jumping the turnpike and moving on its way out to 75, and development is continuing to increase. Is there potential for a different type of ground cover for lawns? And one that would perhaps reduce fertilizer needs, one that could provide biodiversity and ecosystem services for animals and insects and wildlife, and one that could save water as well. We do have limited water resources here. And is there a way that perhaps we could integrate native plants into our traditional turf grass or have an alternative to traditional turf grass? So this was kind of the why we wanted to start looking at different plants and blending those with grasses, and to see what those benefits would be, and also to see what the public would want to get out of it as well. Okay. So this is not a new concept. You know, we didn't come up with this in a giant light bulb. I think there's been a little bit of traction around this concept out of the University of Minnesota. They have a product called Bee Lawns, and there's a website for that. And there are Freedom Lawns that are being promoted from the University of Maryland. And that's not necessarily about blending plants with turf, but it's a little bit more about how you maintain the lawn, creating a Freedom Lawn. And then Michigan State has pollinator lawns. And then if you speak with master gardeners, or you speak with colleagues or people in the green industry, some folks just have green plants that they mow and they call that a lawn. So but we wanted to ask that question: do Florida native wildflowers or Florida native plants have a place in the urban lawn? Okay, so we assembled an amazing team to do this bit of research with Basil Iannone from FRC, and Brooke Moffis down at the UF-IPAS Lake County Extension Office. She's the extension agent there in Florida Friendly Landscaping, and had been with the Master Gardener program prior to that. She and the Discovery Gardens team there had space for this study to go on, so she's a real key player there. Myself, and then of course Dr. Sandy Wilson, who is our team native plant expert, as well as team photographer, so we had to find a picture of her to include there. Dr. Adam Dale provided the information and the analysis for the insect and arthropod evaluations. And Brian Unruh, turfgrass specialist, also joined us, and his contributions were very valuable to the project. Julia Rencina is a graduate student under Sandy Wilson, and she did a lot of the citizen science training as well as the pollinator data work. And Ron Musgraves is the biologist person and grounds person at Discovery Gardens, and he did all the heavy lifting in this project and was just amazing to us. And then we had the Lake County Master Gardener volunteers, which put in over 250 hours of volunteer time on this project. So we assembled a pretty amazing team, and I think we got some excellent results out of it. And I want to say a big thank you to especially Brooke, Ron, and the Lake County Master Gardeners as we go forward with the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, second that. Thank you to everyone. Okay, so the study objectives, again, you know, lawns are a major component of our urban landscapes. They give us lots of services. You know, they're aesthetically pleasing, they're recreational, they're important culturally. So we wanted to understand that diversity that we're seeing. How does that affect lawn resiliency? Let's envision a future in Florida where there's fertilizer restrictions, or you know, more stronger fertilizer restrictions or stronger water restrictions. Can we have a drought tolerant land cover? Like, so lawn resiliency, we were looking at it from the sense of the maintenance of green plant cover. in the absence of irrigation and fertilization. Then we also wanted to know the ecological benefits of lawn diversity, plant diversity in lawns. And we looked at that through looking at pollinator visits and also through arthropod diversity and abundance, because their arthropods are really kind of a base of a food web for ecosystems, at least a component of that. But, you know, if there are these benefits, who cares if homeowners don't like it? So we were very interested in the perception of people as to what they thought about these ground covers, and also feasibility. We learned lessons through the way about, are these ground covers actually feasible to implement and manage in urban landscapes?
So we had 3 treatments, and they were replicated 6 times in our study at Lake County Extension Office it's in Tavares near Leesburg. And the first treatment was just Bahia grass sod. The second treatment was Bahia grass plus 4 forbs, and I'll define those forbs in a moment. And our third treatment was just solid forbs, 4 forbs blended. And these forbs are native Florida plants. And I think I wanted to mention with this slide, for each treatment, we had a individual lawnmower, so we weren't spreading seeds between the plots. Okay, Basil? So our species selection, and we have to really thank Sandy Wilson so much for helping us drill down to which species should be selected. But we looked at our Bahia grass was Paspalum notatum, just Bahia, the turf type Bahia. For the forbs, we selected Salvia librata, which is a rosette leaf form, so it's very low, and then in the spring blooms a purple bloom. And then we selected lance leaf tickseed, the Coreopsis lanceolata, and this was a little bit taller than we had envisioned, but this blooms in the summer with a bright yellow flower and produces seeds freely. Our next species was frog fruit, Phylla nodiflora, and this is a very low growing ground cover type with small round leaves and inflorescences of white and purple. And then our last forb was sunshine mimosa, Mimosa strigolosa, and this is a legume, and it has dissected leaves and little Q-tip flowers that are purple. And they are very attractive to pollinators. In fact, all of these flowers were attracted to pollinators. And these were selected for their attractiveness, their wildlife benefits, whether they would take mowing or not, how drought tolerant they are. They all are drought tolerant. And they are foot traffic tolerant as well. They are what I consider steppable. And no fertilization is required on these. They're not picky, they're not finicky, and they're pretty tough plants. Then we also we wanted to have seasonality, so we would have color or flowers kind of throughout the growing season. So those were the 4, because we've had to limit it to 4. So those were the ones that we selected. Okay, Basil.
Yeah, and we also, I want to add in that the reason we utilized Bahia grass is because we also knew that was a really good drought tolerant option that is being utilized in landscapes as well, and without fertilization too. So,
and can take no, real reduced or no irrigation. Yeah.
Okay, so what we had here was can people see my pointer? Do they see that at all?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
Good. All right. So on this left picture here is our plot setup from a drone image. Very, very good that we had that. What we have is 18 plots, 2 rows of 9 plots, and we randomly assign one of those 3 treatments to those plots. But we did this in a randomized block design where we designed 6 blocks of 3 plots, and we randomly assigned each treatment within that block. And that was to control for the potential environmental variation that might occur along this long line of plots, so that each treatments were each occurring under similar environmental conditions, and you didn't end up with one treatment all the way at this end and another at that end. And what we would end up seeing in that case is an effective location. So it's a randomized block design. The picture on the right is a picture of us setting up the plots, again with the master gardeners. This was a much bigger tasks than we had envisioned when we started setting up the plots, and if it wasn't for the master gardeners, we wouldn't have been able to pull this off. And they also assisted, as Wendy mentioned, with data collection and also site maintenance.
So to get the plots prepped in January of 2019 or late January and February, there were 3 treatments of glyphosate 2 weeks apart. Prior to us using this land, it had kind of been a parking area or a little bit of a road area, but mostly with native plants and weeds, as well as Bermuda grass. So we had that all had to be knocked back with the glyphosate. And then a sod cutter was brought in, and 1 inch of the topsoil was removed, and took most of the dead Bermuda with it. But I'm sure some of you all may know the rest of that story as well. But that 1 inch sod cutter removal is pretty standard. Jeff Norsini published a lot of data on getting site prepped for wildflowers, and that's one of his recommendations. Then the planting date was March 29th, 2019. So for all the Bahia and the Forbs went in at that time, and they were irrigated twice a day for 3 weeks. And then it was once a day for a week, and then every other day. And then until we weaned it off, and the irrigation was reduced until it was completely stopped on June 25th. So just a few months of irrigation, and then it was stopped. We had to do a little bit of subsequent watering just because we had a very, very dry couple of months in August and September. So they were watered September 12th in 2019. And then there was 1 irrigation on March 31st, 2020. So no subsequent irrigation other than the rainfall, and there was no fertilization. So, but this is a good shot of the plots looking good in the summer there.
Yeah. I just want to add that we originally proposed just cutting off irrigation after establishment, but it was so dry that there was just a danger of losing the plots, and that was not the point of the study. So we needed to irrigate. Yeah.
We had to. Yep.
Yeah.
So all the plots received the same irrigation. They received the same weeding time, and I have 15 minutes up there, but actually the weeding time started off at much more, and this is thank God for the Master Gardeners and for all the help they provided. So originally the weeding was at 45 minutes, and then we had 1 45-minute session, and then we had a few 30-minute sessions, and then after that it did get standardized to 15-minute sessions just to keep the weed pressure down. There was no fertilization, no pesticides, no herbicides. For the mowing schedule, with the dedicated mowers, Bahia grass was mowed as normal, probably about once a week during the growing season. And then the blend, the Bahia plus Forbs, was about once every 2 weeks, and so every other. And then I just checked my data again on the wildflowers and the Forbs only as needed. And after they were for the majority of 2019, the Forbs were mowed once, and they were mowed once in 2020. So very much reduced mowing on the Forb plots.
Good.
We collected data 5 times, and the Master Gardeners were so helpful with this. And they were, I want to talk a little bit about citizen science here. The people who participated were very eager, but when you're working with citizen scientists, they have to be trained. You give them patience because there's a learning curve for them that maybe isn't there for graduate students, etc. They need guidance as they're going along, follow up, check through, and then we also had to be careful because many people were interested in participating with us, but if the more people you put into a plot, the more confusion there can be, number one, and number two, there was a fear of them scaring off pollinators. Not a fear, it actually happened. So when we were trying to do pollinator counts, if you had 20 people there, many of the insects were scared away or blocked from entering the plots. I did see a question pop up that said, what was the mowing height? And the mowing height for all these plots was 4 inches. So as high as we could get the mower to go is where we mowed, because we wanted to conserve the flower heads and the seed bank as much as possible. Okay,
Good.
okay.
So what we collected again was pollinator data. And as Wendy said, working with citizen scientists, we had to try to make this easy. Well, not just for them, we were also collecting data too, and I'm not a pollinator expert, right? So Julia developed this protocol with Sandy Wilson, and it works out very well for citizen scientists. What they did was we stood in front of plots for 5 minutes and we counted the number of times pollinators landed on flowers. If they landed on a leaf or a dead flower, we didn't count it as a pollinator event. But every time they landed on a flower for more than 1 second, it was a pollinator event. And then they documented what type of pollinator it was based on these broad categories: moths and butterflies, honeybees, bumblebees, other types of bees, wasps, flies, and these are love bugs. But dipteran flies are not just house flies. There's a lot of high diversity of flies. And then carpenter bees. And even though these flowers here, there are actually multiple flowers, we treated them each as one head when we counted the flowers. So just to make things easy. Again, we wanted to make this achievable for citizen scientists, but still get good data. And here's some of the results that we have. What this figure shows is the number of visitations for each of the sample periods for these different types of pollinators, okay? So the first thing you can see is if you go across, obviously February's winter, there was no pollination going on. But if you just look at the overarching pattern, you can see that the plots with the most forbs had the most pollination activities in each sampling period. More than Bahia grass and forbs, and more than Bahia grass, which isn't surprising. There's more flowers in there, right? But it also had different types of pollinators. There was, if you count the number of lines here, there were seven different pollinators versus 5 in the Bahia and forbs, different types of pollinators. And then in the Bahia grass, we had flies, other bees, and in November, there was a small amount of butterfly and moths. And these flies in September were love bugs. We had a love bug outbreak, so that was a large amount of the flies occurring during that visit. What this figure here shows then is total pollinator visits across the entire study for each of our treatments. The blue bars are Bahia grass, the gray ones are the mixed plots, and then the orange ones are forbs. So you can see these are the different pollinators that we quantified at the bottom on the bottom axis. And the first thing you can see is that, again, the plots that had forbs had the most pollination visits overall. Bahia grass had the least amount, and then the Bahia forb mix had intermediate levels. One thing that was interesting, an interesting pattern here that I saw was the wasp. We had a lot more wasp in the forb plots than we did in the Bahia grass and forb plots, even though the flower species were the same minus the Bahia grass. So we have to look at that data a little more closely to see what might be affecting that. And I think, yep, okay, so that's all. Oh, and then also I just wanted to point out that the most common pollinator were the flies, different types of flies. Okay, now arthropod abundance and diversity. What we did for this was we set up sticky card traps, and that is just simply, it's a sticky card. It's a yellow card with really sticky glue on it that you hang above the plot. And then for pitfall traps, and that captures the flying insects, the sticky card. And then for the pitfall traps, you put a little tube into the ground filled with soapy water so that animals, the little arthropods, crawl into it, they fall and they can't get out. It's a measure of really activity, a movement of arthropods, ground activity. And that's what we looked at for arthropod abundance and diversity. We put those up after we did our other sampling and left them out for 7 days. So here's what we found with our pitfall traps. This is herbivore richness, arthropod herbivores, things that eat plants, and then abundance. And it's for Bahia grass, Bahia forb plots, and then just forb plots. If you look at this over time, this is what this shows over time. Generally, what you see is that overall, over the entire course of the study, the plots that had forbs in it had higher abundance of herbivore richness and abundance. Bahia and forb plots had an intermediate level, and then Bahia grass had lower levels of herbivore arthropods. There was no difference in the different type of arthropod predators or detritivores, and that was slightly unexpected because if you assume if we know that there's more herbivores and herbivore richness and abundance, we would have thought that there would have been more predatory arthropods there as well, but that wasn't the case. And also we have different types of plant material in these plots with the forbs and the Bahia and forb mixture. So we would have guessed that there would have been different types of detritivores given the diversity of plant material, but also that was not what was expected. What we don't know, though, is what are the effects of these increase of diversity and abundance of herbivore arthropods on higher trophic levels, such as birds. And, of course, we have Mark Hostetler on the call here, so talking next about that. Our study was not designed to look at that. That would have to be done at a much larger spatial scale, but it raises that question. If you notice here in August, there's some very low values. We have no idea. Adam, Dale, and I were discussing that, and we're not exactly sure. So we're going to have to explore that data a little bit more to see what we might have done if there was something that happened with that. And we still have one more sampling period to look at for the data in our November sampling period. Regarding sticky traps, we only analyzed the first 2 sampling periods. We still have 3 more to go, but we actually found no difference among the treatments in abundance or richness for herbivore arthropods, flying the arthropods, predators, or pollinators. So no difference. And one thing I think might be what's causing that sort of lack of difference is scale. Our plots were 2 meters by 2 meters with about a half a meter in between them. So chances are that these plots aren't far enough away from each other to really be sampling different arthropod communities. That might be the most easiest explanation as to why there's no difference. So we're sampling the same arthropod community. In order to look at that, we might need larger plots, larger distances among the plots. And then as a metric of resiliency, we were interested in green plant cover, the percent green plant cover. And that literally is a common vegetation metric where you just look at the plot and say, you estimate visually what percentage of the plot is covered by green plants. It's very standard in vegetation and science. And here's some of the volunteers doing that. So for example, this plot up here in the top is much more, it looks more green than the bottom one. So maybe we would say this is 90% green coverage, whereas down here it might be 70%. I'd have to look at them in person to actually see that, but you see the more brown in the bottom there. So we're using that as an indicator of resiliency because green matters to people in their lawns, right? So here's the data that we have for this. This axis here, the vertical axis, shows percent green cover over the sampling dates for forbs in yellow, forbs green, and that, forbs and grasses in that light green, and then dark green is grasses. And what we generally have is, this was not normal, so we look at the median distributions, which are these black lines. In general, in the summer months when there's more water, the plots that had forbs in them had from 5 to 17% higher green coverage than the Bahia grass plots, right? And you can see there's some low values for the Bahia grass as well. But that switched in the winter time. In the winter when it was dry, plots with Bahia grass had up to 27% higher coverage than the forb plots. And that's because our forbs senesced. The lack of water, they kind of got brown and kind of senesced for the season. They went dormant on us. You can see a less variability in the treatments by the end of the study. It's kind of showing a stabilization in the community, much less variation in how much cover there was. And what we found was the highest cover was actually in the forb and grass mixture plot. So what we're seeing here is pretty interesting. Forbs and grasses contribute the cover in these lawns at different times of the year, essentially. Wet seasons, we're seeing more dominance of the grasses being able to take cover, and then during the, the wet seasons were the forbs and the dry seasons were the grasses. So, and that's important for how these things look, that sort of aspect. So, and which is where Wendy takes over.
Thanks, Basil. That's a good segue. I want to go ahead and address a few questions that have come in, just kind of as a quick check-in, and to repeat that the plots were 3 meters by 3 meters.
Oh, sorry about that.
That was the size of the plot, someone had asked. The plots were planted in full sun. And Brooke Mothis wanted to remind us another reason that Bahia grass was selected as the turf was of its open growth habit, which would allow for seeds of the native plants to be able to come in and then get established that way.
Yeah, great. And a quick apology. For some reason, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing the screen. So thanks, Wendy.
Okay,
Thanks
great.
for fielding those questions.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the engagement in the chat as well. So Basil's last point was interesting, because as the grass did well and the forbs senesced in the wintertime, it was the opposite in the summer. So the forbs were strong and the grass was a little bit less in the summertime. So it was interesting to see how that green cover switched with that seasonal variability. And this played a big role in our public perception data collection. So we had 55 people that came and observed the plots, and we had 2 data collection sites for times for that. The first was in March, and that was an FNGLA meeting that Brooke Moffis hosted at the Lake County Extension Office. And the attendees of the meeting were asked to come out to the plots ahead of time before they actually met in the conference room. This was pre-COVID, pre-March COVID. And they evaluated the plots for us, and I'll share that data with you. But in March of 2020, the plots did not look so great because they were coming off of the dry winter, no irrigation, and so they were brown and a little bit thin, as the data previous showed. And then we had another data collection time in November of 2020, and this was post-COVID, so it was all with COVID restrictions. And they were attendees of the Master Gardener plant sale, as well as a few Master Gardener volunteers. And so they're FNGLA members and guests, Master Gardener volunteer plant sale, as well as the Lake County Master Gardeners. And so I have a question that Essen asked, what were the ages? And the ages were over 50. So that is, I didn't ask that, Essen, but I was there and I saw everyone, so I can attest to that. So 37.5 lived in a community that had a homeowners association board. 84% had lived in Florida for more than 10 years. 70% of those taking the survey maintained their own lawn. And then we asked them to state their importance of certain elements in their landscape, how important that was to them, such as attracting pollinators, reducing pesticide, water conservation, fertilizer reduction, and using native plants. And those were ranked on a scale from 1 to 10. And the majority of the 55 people taking the survey ranked those as either an 8, 9, or 10. All of those is very important to them. Those were ranked as very important. And we also wanted to say that we realize that this audience is a unique audience in that they have experience with the Extension Service. They came and volunteered to say that they would come to an extension event or a Master Gardener plant sale event. So this is not John Q. public, but I feel like it's a little bit more of an informed public around the areas of horticulture and lawn maintenance. So we'll see. All right, Basil. So the first, and this is what they look like in November. So you look at the plots and they look pretty green, but if you look at the plot closest to you on the bottom right-hand side, that's a forb plot looking kind of thin, looking a little senesced. Yep. And then on the right-hand side, number up at the top, Basil, that's full Bahia grass. Number 2 is what it looked like when it was Bahia grass plus forbs, and 3 is the forbs alone plot. And this is what the people said. So in the for the likelihood of using treatment number 1, full Bahia grass in the front yard, 61% said that they were likely to use Bahia grass in the front yard based on how the plots looked. So this is unirrigated Bahia. And then in the backyard, which I thought this was a little bit interesting, it was 52% said that they would be likely to use that in the backyard. So just Bahia grass in the backyard. So I thought that was that's a pretty good number. And so that was interesting finding. Okay. And then for the Bahia grass plus Forbes blend in the front yard, this is the blend of the two. 31% said that they were likely to use the blend in the front yard. If it was possible for them to do that, 31% said that they would use Bahia grass plus Forbes in the front yard. And in the backyard, they said 33% would be likely to use Bahia grass plus Forbes in the backyard. So a pretty, you know, I was a little bit surprised and excited about that. Now for the Forbes only, looking as thin as they did back in November and as thin as they did in March, 18% said that they were likely to use it in their front yard. That's the 100% Forbes in the front yard. And 26% would use 100% Forbes in the backyard as their ground cover. So we are, you know, the seasonality of this, the times that we were able to, because of COVID, go ahead and survey these folks was not ideal. We would love to be able to have another evaluation of public perception in the summer to see, because I think if the plants are blooming and there's obviously butterflies or insects on them, there might be a different outcome to that, but we have to, more data and study is required on that. And then an interesting point at the FNGLA meeting in March of 2020, when it was revealed to the participants what the study was all about, why we were doing this study and the benefits of having either a blended turf or an all Forbes ground cover, their buy-in, they were much more interested. They were much more excited about the project and hoping to see what the results were going to be. So they were more positive towards them once they found out what it was all about. We had kept that kind of quiet prior to, because we didn't want to bias their opinions when they went through and took the plots.
Good.
Okay. All
Okay.
right.
So we'll just wrap this up here. In summary, the plot Forbes with pollinators, plots that had Forbes and more types of pollinators. They also, pollinator visits increased in plots with Forbes. The Bahia grass was visited by pollinators, but you know, an issue with, and as are other turf grasses, they are visited by pollinators, but you know, our management of them prevents flowering from happening often. Arthropod, we had found higher abundance of ground dwelling herbivores in the plots with more Forbes in them, but we found no other effects. Regarding cover, Forb cover was higher in the spring and summer during wet seasons, and then the grass provided more coverage in the fall during dry seasons. And then finally, public preference was in that sort of ranking, Bahia grass over Bahia grass and Forbes, and then Forbes coming in last there. Okay, so.
Okay, so some of the discussion about the study. We had a lot of weed recruitment in these plots, and this was a real sticker for us. So we had there was a little bit of a weed bank in the soil to begin with, and there was a little bit of a weed bank to the south of us. And so weeds came in and the weeding had to be done. So I think to repeat or replicate this study, site prep is very important. Perhaps using a pre-emergent herbicide to really knock that seed bank down. And then the other concept there is, you know, maybe being tolerant of those weed species. You know, if they're native and they're coming in and recruiting, perhaps that might be something that in a real life setting, you would just let those plants go. But we realize that a homeowner is not going to go out there and weed their lawn 15 minutes a couple times a week. That's not the reason why they would be putting in a low maintenance landscape.
Yeah. The other thing we realized was we put these in with plugs, and that was labor intensive. And this, if you're going to do this at a landscape level, there probably needs to be other strategies to approach that. And then higher density of installation of plants might also help with some of the weed suppression. Yeah.
And then our species selection, we only wanted to choose 4 just to keep things a little bit simple. But I believe that the Coreopsis was way too tall growing to be incorporated into this system. So other ones that we have considered with Sandy and Brooke's help determining Dichoristi, the twin flower. There's a very nice low growing one of those that would be staying under that 4 to 5 inches. And then also Salvia miscella could also be a great alternative for that Coreopsis in this system if that's something that they wanted. And one of the questions that's in the chat box, Basil, is do you think that Lake County is a good representative for the whole state? And my answer to that is no, it's going to vary with what native plants in South Florida or North Florida or Northwest Florida or coastal Florida would be best suited for that environment. And so the work would need to be determined on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks. One other thing we realized was, we were like, all right, let's just cut off irrigation and see what happens. But we realized, these things are going to die over the winter if we didn't irrigate them. So some irrigation is still going to be needed for all these plots. But, the number of irrigation events was very low. It would still be lower. It was still lower than what you would see in a more traditional management of lawns. And that was across all of our plots, all the Bahia grass and our forward plots. So, yeah.
Someone did ask what type of irrigation we used. And I think it was just a simple spray head.
Yeah.
It wasn't micro irrigation. It was just a simple spray head.
Yeah.
So, we had just such a positive experience working with the citizen scientists. And again, I have to thank Julia for doing such an amazing job in training them. Citizen scientists really want to learn, they want that connection, and they really very much enjoy being connected to the university and IFAS research. So that was a real positive, but a little bit of patience and front end work with those citizen scientists really pays off dividends on the backside.
Yeah, and it's really important to be teaching the scientific literacy and methods to people. So the last point I want to raise is the need for interdisciplinary participation in this project. I mean, we looked at the social dimensions and the ecological aspects of this. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have a full picture. Like for me as an ecologist, I say, oh, look, there's more pollinators and forbs. Let's put them out in yards. But without that sort of understanding that like, hey, people really don't like this in the wintertime, that allows us to think about the next step of more effectively that we can apply into real urban landscapes. So great. And then we'll just wrap it up because I think we're getting to our time, right? So I just wanted to point out that this has made some pretty cool impacts. There's 2 plant producers, including Green Isle Gardens, who are now looking at strategies for producing and installing mixed native landscapes that have come and looked at our plots and have been influenced by them. So that's a really good impact. And then also Brian Unruh's student, Augustin Barrero, I hope I didn't butcher your name too bad. He's doing a really interesting project following up on this, looking at other types of alternative land covers and the environmental benefits and cost of those and effects on nutrient leaching and also some of the environmental impacts on the different installation strategies. So there's good work coming in ahead of this. So, and with that, Wendy, and we can just thank everyone.
I just want to thank Lake County Extension, and we also want to thank the Center for Land Use Efficiency for funding this study. We got a lot of use out of the funding, and we really appreciate it. And I just want to reiterate that Basil and I are just the messengers of this. This is a whole team effort, and just a big thanks to the team. And if you're checking the chat box, Brooke is over there answering questions. So she's
good. Thank you.
What kind of sprinklers to put in and that sort of thing. So thank you all very much.
And I think we're at our limit. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Great. Thank you, Basil and Wendy. Super interesting. I know a lot of us have been following this project over time. And imagine 155 people clapping and kind of hollering and really enjoying your talk. So thank you again. We are out of time for your talk, but the questions keep coming in. As you said, Brooke has answered many of them, but there's still a few in there. Maybe right before we transition, are you going to continue the project? There were several questions that kind of had that as their basis.
Brooke should answer that. No, Brooke's actually applying for a PhD in SNRE to work with me to kind of advance this project. So I'm really excited. We're all really excited about that. So thank you, Brooke.
right.
And I think that'll be great to start to look at the both the ecological and practical aspects of this sort of potential alternative or different style of lawns that people might be interested in. Yeah.
Great, very good. Well, if you're both are going to stick around and you want to hit the chat, then take a look and you have a stab at addressing some of those questions. But we're going to go ahead and transition to
Thank you.
Mark's talk now. So thank you both. All right, up next we have Dr. Mark Hostetler, and continuing our biodiversity theme today, he is going to tell us about birds and conservation, I think.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone out there. This is a good follow-up to the talk that we just heard, but we're going to switch to kind of bigger things, birds and trees. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, first, I'm going to be talking about conserving bird habitat in cities, and this is in collaboration with two of my students, Yan and Ryan. Yan did a lot of the work on this Building for Birds tool that I'll be talking about, and Ryan is just now completing his master's, and he did some work with urban bird habitat and selection in the Gainesville area. So the way I structured the talk, I've looked at three sections. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background on conserving bird habitat. And then I'll talk about this evaluation tool and how you can evaluate different development designs and impacts on birds. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some new research that's ongoing and just starting in my lab. So here's the problem. There's really, if you're thinking about creating or conserving bird habitat, there's no evaluation tool that synthesizes all the research out there and gives you useful information for decision makers, such as planners, developers, and even the public. So I'm going to be focusing on forest birds. And so if you look at the image on the left there, the yellow is forest patches and the green is developed area. And compare that design to the one on the right, where you have a large forest patch conserved with a smaller patch, the same amount of area. But the question is, which birds does it impact? And is one design better for during different seasons, like during migration or breeding or wintering? So how do we, if you're looking at cities that are expanding, or if you're trying to retrofit neighborhoods, how do different designs impact different forest birds? And so to do that, I'll give you a little bit of background about the natural history of birds. First of all, if you think about seasons of a bird, they have a breeding season. Of course, that's where they're raising their chicks, laying their eggs. There's a wintering or non-breeding season. And then there's, for those that are migrating, there's a fall and spring migration season. Now, the reason why that's important is that during these different seasons, there's some information that different birds use habitat differently. So keep that in mind as we go throughout the talk. And also think about year-round species or resident species versus migrants. So we have cardinals and mockingbirds and tufted titmouse here in Florida, and also the screech owl. So they're breeding and wintering pretty much in the same place. But then we have a whole suite of migrants, hundreds of species of migrants. Here's a few neotropical migrants that come through Florida. And so if I were to highlight the yellow warbler, the burnt orange is where they breed. So you're not going to see during the summer yellow warblers in Florida. But during the migration season, during the fall and during the spring, you're going to see them passing through. And as they're passing through, they require habitat to refuel, to rest, for shelter. And so they may have different habitat requirements. You can provide that habitat in your yards and neighborhoods. And they're migrating in the blue area all the way down to the Columbian Basin in South America and also in Central America. So keep that in mind, that there's migrants and there's resident birds, and providing habitat, you could perhaps do different types of habitat features to attract these different species. So really the take home is that an individual yard or neighborhood can serve as a breeding site, a wintering site, and a stopover site or dispersal site. So different species may appear in the city at different times of the year. I'm sure a lot of you who are birders out there know this. They're waiting for the winter seasons when you got the goldfinches and the yellow-rumped warblers appearing, and then they go back up north to breed. So if we're going to create an evaluation tool, first we need to synthesize that data that's out there. Which species occur in cities, which ones use fragments, which ones use residential areas, and then build a simple online tool that people can use. So I'm going to quickly go over what Yan and I did. We first looked at all the papers that looked at breeding in forest fragments, and we were interested in what birds actually do breed in forest fragments and which ones are area sensitive, or what they're called interior forest specialists. Those birds don't typically breed in the forest fragments, so you wouldn't really see them in the cities. And then there's another suite of literature called Stopover Ecology, and this is looking during the migration season, and we look to see at different sizes of forest fragments which species were stopping over in these habitats. And then the last synthesis was looking at urban bird studies, and these are like in residential neighborhoods with trees, of course, because we're looking at forest birds. We're looking at the presence during the breeding in migration season. So it's really, we're trying to get a list and how many species are out there that potentially could use habitat within cities. So let's skip right to the results. For breeding in forest fragments, we found that, and these are studies that were done throughout the United States and Canada. So we had about 75 species, and we were conservative whether we actually counted them as breeding in a forest fragment. We said we had to have 3 or more studies that indicated this before we said, yeah, they probably do breed in forest fragments. Now, importantly, we kind of synthesized the literature, and we found at least 15 interior forest specialist species that would not breed in these small fragments. Now, for the stopover studies, we found 116 species. These are a lot of migrants that use small fragments, and most of these were long-distant neotropical migrants that go from North America to South America. And in fact, as you'll hear throughout the talk, many of what we call the interior forest species that breed in large forested habitats use these fragments as stopover. Now for the built environment, we had 109 species, 70 using during the breeding season, and 82 using residential areas as stopover sites during migration seasons. And this is even interior forest specialists. So really the take home message is that there's a lot of species out there. If trees are there, if forest fragments are available, can provide habitat. And give you one example of interior forest specialists like this American redstart. You only see these passing through Florida. They breed up north in large forest tracts, but they use both urban forest patches and residential areas, trees in residential areas. So given that bird list now we have, and we kind of have a better idea about different seasons and how birds are utilized in habitat, if you were going to design a new development or expand a city and you were conserving forest patches this way or that way, what kind of bird habitat score would you get? So I know that URL, that's pretty long, but if you just Google building for birds and put in University of Florida, it will take you to the site and take you to the tool. And I encourage people, if you're not used this tool, try the tool out and give me some feedback on how you could use it in your situation. So here's the steps. We first started out with GIS. It was really pretty complicated when we started thinking about doing it that way and upkey of the site. And we got feedback, and when we were doing this, we got feedback from planners and developers saying, no, we need something simple, something like we could do on the back of a paper napkin. So what we did is, if you're doing a site and you're developing it, there's 2 inputs. One is the patch sizes of conserved late and early successional forests. And the reason why we do late versus early is that there's more species that use late successional forests. That's mature forest, think tree canopy cover. And then we gave points for just conserving tree canopy cover in the built areas. Because often a lot of times developers say, well, it's much easier taking down all the vegetation. Why do we need to have anything? But as we've seen through our synthesis, tree canopy can be important habitat for migrating and for resident birds. So there's 5 steps to this tool. And each step is just looking at the development site and coming up with a design for it. So you can imagine you can have a site with scattered forest patches conserved or clumped forest patches, and you can choose your scenario, put in your project name. And then you can put in how much late successional forest in acres is conserved and how much early successional forest in acres is conserved. And this is looking at the breeding, and I put up there wintering habitats because that's reference for resident birds. If you're breeding in the area, you're also wintering in that area as well. And so what's the difference between late successional and early successional forest? Well, just think in terms of canopy cover over your head. So if you're walking through Florida, this was a typical late successional forest. And this is early successional forest. And so the reason why we did this is that more species, because it takes a long time to grow a tree, more species use that mature forest, and the edge around that forest patch is also early successional forest. So you just capture more species that way. When we were doing the review of the stopover ecology studies, we found in the literature indications that even though they were small patches being conserved and measured in terms of abundance and diversity of birds, slightly larger patches tended to have more species and higher abundance. So we gave more points if you had your, if you're conserving patches of forest, if you did the larger ones, you would get more points for doing that versus the smaller ones. And then finally, it was just a number of tree canopy cover, the acres that was conserved or planned to conserve during the development phase. And so you just put in how much canopy cover would be conserved. And then it would submit a score. And the score would be divided out into that breeding, wintering, like for resident birds, for habitat, for stopover habitat score, and a built environment habitat score, and bird lists. So we had that bird list for each of these scores that you can find. And so you can imagine for a site, depending on the scenario, those bars are shifting back and forth depending on how much tree canopy cover or the sizes of patches and the quantity of forest that you retain during the development. So let's work through an example here. And this is kind of the behind the scenes look at the algorithm as well. So let's say you have 100 acres and you're developing 50 acres on the site and you're conserving 50. Well, you can do it many different ways. So in this scenario, there was some early successional forest to begin with, but that's where the development went. And so 0% was conserved, 71% was conserved for late successional, and 80% of the areas in the developed areas that are going to be developed is marked for conservation. And so here's how the algorithm works. It's a simple more points for late successional versus early successional. And then if you are looking at patch sizes, you get more points for larger fragments than you do for smaller fragments. And that's for the stopover habitat score. And then it gives you that a readout. And if you do different designs, you can compare different scores to see how that improves or does not improve the amount of avian habitat for stopover habitat or for breeding / wintering habitat or even tree canopy within the built environment. So this is kind of really where we hang our hat on, because there hadn't been a synthesis done to this point. And this is all published in Landscape and Urban Planning. If you like, I can give you the citation by email or in the chat. What we did, and again, we really, there's a lot of caveats to this, but what planners and developers wanted was just give us a check, an X or a question mark, whether a bird can breed or whether it uses stopover habitat in the city or not. So if we look at the ruby-throated hummingbird, if you lived in the city, you know ruby-throateds are all over the place, and the literature bears this out. They both breed in residential areas and forest fragments, and they use them as stopover habitat as they're migrating. But there's other species like the black and white warbler. So the black and white warbler is an interior forest specialist based on our synthesis, so they won't normally breed in forest fragments. They use forest fragments as stopover habitat. Well, of course, they don't breed in residential areas, but then there's this question mark here of stopover in residential areas. So the reason why we have a question mark is in many cases, we didn't have enough studies, 3 studies or more. So for the black and white, we had 2 studies that indicated that, yeah, they were found in residential areas during the migration season, but we put that question mark there just to be conservative. And then looking at the yellow warbler, same type of thing, that question mark in the residential areas and blank in that list. And all of this is online at that Building for Birds, that's bird list. That means there was no studies on this yellow warbler, and we need to further investigate this. So what are the take-home messages? Well, one is that urban areas matter for the diversity of species and habitat for birds. So in residential areas, it can provide stopover and breeding habitat for over 100 forest bird species. And this could be well over 180 because there are a lot of indicators that they did use it, but they weren't at our criterion of 3 studies or more. For forest fragments that provide stopover and breeding habitat for over 130 forest bird species. And again, this could be over 200 because we found indications, but we were conservative and said we just need to investigate that further. And interestingly, that some of the interior forest specialists that use forest fragments in residential areas as stopover habitat. So 10 of the 15 still will use these fragments even though they're breeding in large forest tracts. So for the conservation of many of these species, because many of these interior forest specialists are declining, that stopover habitat can provide refuge and shelter and refueling opportunities as they're migrating. Now, once we did this, of course, when you do any study as a scientist, it just raises more questions. And one of the questions a question was that, is a bird, if it's found in the built area, do they really prefer residential areas or forest fragments? Because there was some ambiguity, particularly for several of the species, whether they actually would prefer to use a forest fragment versus a residential area. And the reason why that is, if you think about a lot of these species, when you look at residential areas, they tend to be more savanna-like. You have low ground cover and then tree canopy cover and not much in between. But in a forest fragment, you have a lot of what we call vertical height diversity. So Ryan, my graduate student who just completed a study, he's writing up the results. It's not published yet, but what we have found so far, preliminary data, and he asked this question, do different species prefer urban forest fragments versus residential? And he did this in Gainesville, Florida. And so he randomly put point counts in residential versus nearby urban forest fragments. So if you look at the graphic below, there's residential on the right, there's the edge. So there's a point count that has residential edge and residential forest. The forest fragment, and then on the left side, the forest fragment. And so he would do these point counts and he would compare occurrence of each species that he found in these point counts and whether they occurred equally across the point counts or they were preferring, or they're actually occurring in one more than the other. So he found about 49 species across the study site. So these are all migrants. So a lot of migrants do use residential areas, forest fragments, etc. But some migrants occurred more often in the forest fragments with more vertical height structure. So we actually did measurements of the vertical height structure between the forest fragment and the residential areas. And of course, the forests had more vertical height structure. Now, looking at the foraging of those 49 species, the more canopy foraging birds, such as the northern purrelet, use both the residential and the forest fragments somewhat equally or not different from each other. So if you think about it, you know, there's tree canopy in residential areas, there's tree canopy in the forest fragments, and those both provide habitat for the northern parula. But the birds that typically forage under the canopy prefer the forest fragment, which makes intuitive sense that they require more vegetation, more structure, such as the worm-eating warbler. It's not all the species. There are some that tend to use both equally. So it was interesting to see that foraging strategy could be an influence about what species occur in the forest fragment versus the residential area. So what are the take-home messages? I mean, how do you create urban bird habitat? Well, I think the one message, and when we've been doing this for years and working with developers and city planners, is that, well, should we just not concerned about the large forests outside of cities and just let the urban kind of, you know, don't really worry about the urban area? But the synthesis and a lot of urban ecologists say, no, you can provide a lot of habitat within cities for a wide variety of birds, and conserving both, even the small forest fragment and individual trees in residential areas helps to create that habitat. And if you're looking at late successional versus early and you're going to build somewhere, late successional forest is a bit better. Larger patches tend to attract more migrants as stopover habitat. So thinking about if you're trying to look at a landscape and you're saying, well, where do I put the residential homes and the roads? If you have a more compact development that promotes larger patches of forest, you tend to increase the diversity of birds that would occur in that area. And with Ryan's study, increasing vertical height structure in residential areas may benefit more species. So, of course, the forest fragment has that vertical height structure, but in a residential area, you could cluster trees and shrubs in quote unquote re-wild areas that give that vertical height structure and could attract those species that normally would not be in the residential area, and using them as stopover sites. So thinking about clustering trees, promoting kind of wild areas surrounded perhaps by bordered landscapes and mowed lawn, this is a good way to create a heterogeneous environment that allows a wider variety of species. Now, another question that we had is, are there regional differences? Probably 80%, well, about 70% of the studies were done in the Northeast, particularly for a lot of the migrating species. And so the northern parula, if you're a birder in Florida, they're not here, but they will be here soon to breed. Is there a difference between the Northeast and the Southeast? And anecdotally, if you go on eBird or other types of citizen science platforms, you see northern parulas all the time in the city of Gainesville. So, but up Northeast are considered interior forest specialists during the breeding season. At least the studies really kind of indicate that they need large forest tracts to breed in. But does the northern parula breed in residential areas in Gainesville, Florida? I have another student in my lab, Natalie Pegg, who's looking at northern parula and also looking at the summer tanager and the pileated woodpecker from our synthesis, also indicated that they were interior forest species, but we kind of see them in and around Gainesville. So we just want to document where they're occurring and also what type of habitat they're using. So what I've kind of shared with you is kind of a snapshot of more of a design, you know, structure, vegetation, more trees, forest patches in cities can attract a wide variety of species. But there's more to it than that. And this book I published a few years back called The Green Leap, there's a couple other phases we have to think about when we think about forest fragments and conserving trees. Is one, during construction, you have to protect the trees and so they don't die once the homeowner moves in. So if you have earthwork machines running over the root zones, they may be quote unquote conserved, but they're going to die in the next few years due to impact on the soil. And then think in terms of post-construction, and when you're managing forest fragments in residential areas over the long term, there's a lot of decisions that are made by homeowners that can impact the quality of the habitat. So if they're planted in exotics or invasive exotics. So exotic trees, there are studies out there that show that exotic trees compared to native trees don't have as much insect diversity. And of course, a lot of those migrating species and resident birds are eating insects. So there's not good foraging habitat for them. So you have to think about the management of these properties and of the forest nearby, particularly invasive exotics. If people plant invasive exotics in their yards, it's going to spread into forests and impact the habitat quality. I could go on. There's many more management impacts, such as feral cats and over irrigation and fertilization. There's a lot of synergies between the previous talk and this one. We're talking about management of landscapes for natives, because when you're managing landscapes for natives, you reduce a lot of the irrigation, or you could potentially reduce the irrigation fertilization that has impacts on the nearby forest patches. So I think thinking in terms of alternative landscapes, both at the ground level and with trees, can really increase the biodiversity value within cities. So I think, I did okay, got within 30 minutes there. I'm from the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, and there's a lot of information about the wildlife in Florida that you can glean information. And also, if you have questions after this talk, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. I'm going to take this off the view screen so I can see the chat, because I think I have time to answer a few questions.
There's a couple questions. I put the link to your Building for Birds website. I put that in the chat.
Sure, great.
And so the first question was, and I think I know the answer now. This was asked earlier in the presentation, but are you focusing on species that you would see only in Florida, the Southeast, or throughout the U.S.?
Yeah, the synthesis was throughout the U.S. So we did the synthesis as birds in the eastern part of the United States, the western part of the United States, and Canada. So any study that was done there, we synthesized that. But for my current graduate students, they're all focused on Florida. In fact, they're looking at Gainesville with the whole COVID situation. It's been, as urban ecologists, has been good that we could do things literally in our own backyard. We don't have to travel so far. So they are really doing some interesting studies right now. Look for a couple of papers from my graduate student, Ryan, that we'll be publishing here this year sometime.
Very good. So someone points out that northern Parula are in older residential neighborhoods with live oaks in Tallahassee.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about the northern Parulas, we see them in Gainesville all over as well. Sometimes ecology is doing a lot of research for the obvious, but we have to do the research. Northern Parulas, they nest up north in moss and hanging moss. And so we have a lot of Spanish moss here in Gainesville and in Tallahassee. So particularly oaks, sweet gums, other things that have Spanish moss is nesting material for the northern Parula. So that's one part of the study that Natalie will be doing, is trying to see what type of trees within residential neighborhoods the northern Parula is found on.
Question came in, were any human planted green spaces evaluated, not a forest? This is kind of related to something I wanted to ask you too.
So human planted. So a lot of the forest patches within cities, particularly if you're thinking about the eastern United States, have been cut down once. So it's all secondary growth. Planted forests, depending on how they are managed, can provide significant amount of habitat. It's all about the management when these planted pines or planted hardwoods. So yes, they can provide habitat. The one thing I think is important to think about is the invasive. So if a forest patch is not a forest patch, if it's overrun with invasives like Melaleuca down south or Brazilian pepper down south, it's not as good as habitat as a more natural habitat. So you really have to think about managing the invasives that occur in these patches. But yeah, managed forests can provide habitat for a variety of migrating species.
So the person who has a question, they followed up and said planted trees in yards.
Yes. So the built environment synthesis showed that many species use tree canopy cover within residential areas. So planted species in yards, particularly if they're native, provide habitat for not only breeding species, but also migrating species that stopover habitat. So for sure, they do. Planted species count in terms of habitat.
Okay, another question just came in. Does this mean that unmanaged forests are not best for wildlife and maybe specifically birds?
Well, it depends on, again, where that forest is. So a lot of unmanaged forest is really good habitat for wildlife because for whatever reason, it's away from cities and it's not being inundated with invasives or fertilized water or air pollution, et cetera. So yeah, unmanaged is probably more wild is the best way to do it. However, a lot of the forest patches are kind of in the matrix of urban and rural. And so you have to manage those somewhat. Now, there is no way in the state we're in terms of the Anthropocene era that we're going to have truly all natural. There's going to be a combination of exotics, invasive exotics, and natives. And I think what is important to understand is that we're not trying to go back to all native. We have what's called recombinant ecosystems. So there's a whole host of literature out there that says, you know, we can't go all the way back to totally native, but we can at least manage it to have more natives that would be there that if we didn't manage it at all. So think of it in terms of recombinant ecosystems. So I'm looking out in my yard right now, and there's a sword fern, there's white flower, I can't remember the name of that one, the white flower plant that's considered invasive. However, there's lots of species that come in my yard that are native, both plant and animals. So don't think of it as getting rid of all the invasive, all the exotics. Think of it as just combining and thinking about managing more for the natives so it brings out more habitat for species.
So is it accurate to say something's better than nothing? I mean, I'm thinking of, when I say that, I'm thinking of, you know, Central Florida, there's no trees to start with, and a development comes in, new houses, construction, and every house gets a tree. I mean, that's not what you're talking about with these forest tracks, but it's something.
Well, actually, it is what I'm talking about because that built area with those individual trees are habitat for
Right.
Yeah. So for sure, I think what people when I talk, it's beginning to change. A lot of people think, well, it's urban. Like, let's just forget about it. Let's go outside. But no, the combination of the urban, the rural, and the natural and the urban is critical for providing habitat and increasing biodiversity across the whole region. So I think the urban is very important, particularly, like you said, a little bit is good, but if you plant invasive, that can be horrible and that can spread into the natural area. So we want to minimize impacts from the urban area into the natural area. And part of that is realizing, hey, if we're planting natives and we're not planting invasives, you know, we're also improving the habitat within the city and minimizing impact on nearby habitat.
Yep. Good. Well, folks, this is your last chance, live anyway, ask your questions.
I think someone said, will there be eventually testing done to communities with different water sources, wells, reclaim? Oh, that's another one. Yeah.
Yeah, they were blowing up the chat still on the Forbes. There was great interest in the Forbes. Not to take away from birds, but great interest. So I was talking with a former extension agent a couple years ago, and from an urban area from St. Pete, and she had mentioned that the bird diversity had really been reduced in that area just because of the development, and the area is just so overbuilt. Is there any way to turn that around in these areas that are built up, you know, to the extent that a place like St. Pete is built?
Mhm. I think there is. There are ways to, again, for the forest birds, just planting a native tree and letting it grow over years. It might take decades, but yeah, you can definitely improve it. And what I think it's what I call controlled chaos, having sections of lawns that just go wild and you can border it, make it look aesthetically pleasing. That can promote the diversity of birds and insects in the neighborhood. So yeah, I think you can retrofit almost any community. It just takes a little bit of um, emphasis, both from policy, from developers, and from individuals.
That actually segues into a question we just got. Are there any laws to protect particularly old trees in Gainesville?
Yes, there are. In fact, they have heritage tree laws, large, particular live oaks and some other species that are protected. And if a tree becomes diseased and you have to take it down, there's laws that you have to replant them with trees. So Gainesville is considered Tree City USA, and that tries to cover more than 50% of our city in tree canopy.
Are there laws like that in elsewhere, most of Florida, or is that Gainesville's an outlier in terms of the protection it gives?
There are other cities. Tampa has similar types of forest plans. So yeah, there are other cities that have those type of laws as well. But yeah, Gainesville and Alachua County tends to be kind of really trying to keep that tree canopy.
Another question. Do invasive birds like peafowl negatively impact native birds?
Well, it depends on the species, but yeah, the peafowl, not really. But of course, you can imagine if you have like hundreds of peafowl in one area, it's going to really tear up the vegetation. So it just depends. Most likely, it does not affect the native birds, particularly the forest ones. If you have trees and peafowl underneath, it's probably okay.
What are the next steps so you've developed this tool, and I just glanced at it's on your website, and then now what are the next steps?
Well, the next steps is for putting in the hands of people that make decisions. So we've been going around the country. It really bolsters the tree laws because they say, oh, trees are good for water, they're good for shading, for energy, but they're also good for biodiversity. So it helps bolster those laws. So it's a backdrop for that. But also for decision makers like a developer, they could say, well, it's so difficult to put this road around these trees. Why don't I just cut the trees down and put it in there? And this helps give them the impetus, say, no, there's a lot of species that use those individual trees. And so we're working with a few developers and using this tool to show that, hey, those trees, keep that individual live oak that's in that pasture right now and build around it.
Right. All right, we're kind of winding up here. Any other questions from the audience? I'm just paging back through to see if I didn't miss anything. And so when the cardinals show up in my yard, that means it's spring. Is that right?
Now the cardinals are all year round. So they're showing up because they're hungry. It's cold out right now.
Okay. They just seem to get very active in late winter, early spring.
Yeah, they're hungry, especially at the bird feeder.
I don't have a bird feeder.
No.
Okay, well, I guess that's it. Mark, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And imagine 100+ people, kind of clapping very loudly and cheering you on, because that's how many people we still have on. So thanks again. And the thank yous are coming in on the chat. Thanks to our other speakers as well. And we will see everyone next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Have a good day, everybody.